You are listening to HOA Boardroom Battles. One missing page turned into a whole cover-up. Your file is getting thicker today. That is what Deborah Ramirez said when she slammed the printed minutes packet down on the table in front of me. Karen yelled that my evidence binder was intimidation and she would have security remove me. I stood there in the Sequoia Terrace Reserve Association Management Office lobby in Rochester, New York, with my tan light jacket soaking up the drizzle from outside and a roll of caution tape looped over my left wrist like a bracelet. The binder was 4 inches thick and tabbed with sticky notes, and Deborah was pointing at it like it was a weapon. She had her flashlight out, the heavy black mag light she carried on her belt like a deputy, and she was shining it at the binder pages even though the overhead fluorescents were already harsh and bright. I am a pool service technician, which means I understand HOA politics better than most people, because I work on community pools in 5 different associations, and I see how the boards operate from the inside. Deborah is the records custodian for Sequoia Terrace, which means she controls access to every document, every email archive, every enforcement file, and every board packet that gets sealed before a vote. She has been stalling my records request for 3 weeks, and today I showed up with proof that she was doing it on purpose. The conflict started 6 months ago when the HOA began targeting my guests and contractors with parking warnings and intimidation. I rent a townhouse in Sequoia Terrace, and my lease has a strict addendum tied to HOA compliance. If I get 3 violations on record, my landlord can terminate the lease with 30 days' notice. The HOA knows this because Deborah pulled my lease from the management company files and mentioned it during a board meeting in July. I was not there, but a neighbor recorded it and sent me the audio. Deborah said my lease addendum made me easier to control because I would fold under pressure. She was wrong. The parking warning started in August. My brother visited for a weekend and parked in a guest spot with a valid guest pass displayed. Deborah left a violation notice on his windshield anyway, claiming the pass was expired even though I had just printed it that morning from the resident portal. The notice had a 48-hour deadline and threatened a $50 fine if I did not respond with proof of compliance. I responded the same day with a screenshot showing the pass was active, and Deborah sent back an email saying the format was incorrect and I needed to resubmit using a different template. I asked what template, and she said it was in the policy manual. I checked the manual, and there was no template. I emailed her back, and she did not respond for a week. By then the deadline had passed and she issued the fine. That was the first goalpost move. The second one came in September when I hired a contractor to replace my back porch railing. The contractor parked his van in the driveway, which is allowed under the CC and Rs for service vehicles. Deborah showed up 20 minutes after he arrived, clipboard in hand, and told him he was in violation of the commercial vehicle restriction. The contractor pointed out that the restriction only applies to overnight parking, and it was 2 in the afternoon. Deborah said the rule had been updated, and she would be filing a complaint with the board. She never showed me the updated rule. She just filed the complaint, and I got a hearing notice in the mail 3 days later. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday night, and I had to take off work to attend. When I showed up, Deborah was sitting at the head table next to the board president, and she had a stack of printed complaint forms in front of her that all looked identical. She read the complaint out loud, saying my contractor had been aggressive and disrespectful to her during the inspection. The contractor was not even there to defend himself. I objected, and the board president told me I would get my turn to speak. When it was my turn, I explained that the contractor had been polite and professional, and I had doorbell camera footage to prove it. Deborah interrupted and said doorbell footage was not admissible because it had not been submitted in advance. I asked where that rule was written, and she pointed to a section of the bylaws about evidence submission. I read the section out loud, and it said nothing about doorbell cameras. The board president told me to move on. I moved on, and the board voted to uphold the complaint. That was my second violation on record. The third escalation happened in October. I got an email from an attorney representing the HOA. The email was 3 paragraphs of bluff language designed to scare me into paying a $500 fine for cumulative violations. The fine was not mentioned in the hearing notice, and it was not in the bylaws as a penalty tier. I called the attorney office, and the paralegal told me the fine was based on a board resolution passed in a closed session. I asked for a copy of the resolution, and she said I would need to submit a records request to the HOA. I submitted the request to Deborah the same day. She responded 48 hours later saying the resolution was exempt from disclosure under the privacy clause. I read the privacy clause, and it only applied to individual homeowner disputes, not policy resolutions. I emailed her back and cited the section number. She did not respond. A week later, I got a second attorney letter threatening a lien if I did not pay the fine within 10 days. That is when I decided to reopen the cold case. The cold case involved missing money from the reserve fund. 2 years ago, before I moved into Sequoia Terrace, the HOA had collected a special assessment to repair the community pool filtration system. The assessment was $200 per unit, and there are 64 units in the neighborhood, which means the fund should have had $12,800. The filtration repair was completed, and the vendor invoice was posted in the board minutes. The invoice total was $9,200. That left a balance of $3,600, but the reserve fund balance at the end of that fiscal year showed zero. No one asked where the money went because the board said it was reallocated to legal fees. But there was no line item for legal fees in that year's budget, and no attorney invoices were ever posted. I found this out because I requested the full financial records for the past 3 years as part of my current records request. Deborah charged me $250 for the records, which is triple the state maximum, and she delivered them on a USB drive in unsearchable PDF scans. I ran OCR on the scans and built a spreadsheet. The numbers did not add up. The reserve fund had been drained, and the only person with access to approve fund transfers without a board vote was the records custodian, which was Deborah. I started gathering clues. The first clue was a timestamp mismatch. The board minutes from the month the assessment was collected showed the vote happening on a Tuesday night. But the meeting notice posted on the community bulletin board was dated the Thursday after the vote, which meant residents did not get the required 72-hour advance notice. I took a photo of the notice with my phone, and you could see the date stamp on the printed page. The second clue was a signature stack. I pulled complaint forms from 3 different enforcement cases over the past year, including mine, and all 3 forms had identical handwriting in the resident's signature field. The handwriting matched Deborah's signature on the records request invoice she had sent me. Someone had been filling out complaint forms and forging resident signatures to create a paper trail. The third clue was a metadata audit. I opened the unsearchable PDF scans Deborah had given me and checked the file properties. The creation date on most of the files was less than a week old, which meant the documents had been recreated or altered recently. Original scans from 2 years ago would have older metadata. I saved screenshots of the property's windows and added them to my binder. I did not mention my evidence yet because I wanted her to repeat the story first. That was my strategy going into the showdown. If Deborah kept lying on the record, I could use her own words against her when I finally revealed the proof. The board packet for the next meeting was being finalized this afternoon, and I had to get my evidence included before it was sealed. Once the packet was sealed, new evidence could not be added without a board vote, and Deborah controlled the agenda. I called the management company and asked to speak to the regional supervisor. The receptionist put me through, and I explained that I had evidence of financial misconduct and I needed it included in the board packet today. The supervisor said she would arrange a meeting in the parking lot at 4, and I should bring my documentation. I showed up at 3:45 with my binder and the roll of caution tape I had been using to mark off areas around pool equipment at work sites. I looped the tape over my wrist because I thought it looked official, and I wanted Deborah to know I was treating this like a crime scene. Deborah arrived at 4:10. She pulled into the lot in a silver sedan with an HOA parking placard on the dash, and she got out holding her flashlight and a key ring with at least 20 keys jangling on a carabiner clip. She saw me standing near the management office entrance with the binder, and her face went red before she even reached me. She walked fast, almost jogging, and she started yelling before she was within 10 feet. "If you want mercy, move somewhere without an HOA." That was her catchphrase, and she used it every time someone challenged her. She said it at hearings, she said it in emails, and she said it now, loud enough that two people walking to their cars turned around to watch. I stayed calm and held the binder up so she could see the tabs. I said I was here to meet the regional supervisor, and I had evidence that needed to be reviewed before the board packet was sealed. Deborah said the packet was already sealed, and no new materials would be accepted. I checked my phone, it was 4:12. The supervisor had told me the deadline was 5. Deborah said the deadline had been moved up, and the packet had been sent to the printer at noon. That was the third goalpost move, and it happened in real time with witnesses. A property manager came out of the office at that moment, a young guy in a polo shirt with a forced smile like he had been told to defuse the situation. He stood between us and asked if everything was okay. Deborah said everything was fine, and I was just leaving. I said I was not leaving until I spoke to the regional supervisor. The property manager looked uncomfortable. He said the supervisor was running late, but she had called and asked him to accept any documentation I wanted to submit. Deborah cut him off and said he did not have the authority to accept documentation outside the packet deadline. The property manager looked at her, then at me, then back at her. He said the supervisor had specifically told him to accept it. Deborah raised her voice and said the supervisor was overstepping, and the board had final authority over packet contents. The property manager asked her if she wanted to call the supervisor and clarify. Deborah said no, and she turned to me and said if I did not leave, she would have security remove me. There was no security. Sequoia Terrace Reserve Association does not have security. Deborah was bluffing, and the property manager knew it. He stepped back and told Deborah he was going to call the supervisor right now. Deborah told him not to, and her voice cracked a little. I opened the binder to the first tab section and said I had evidence of financial misconduct, forged signatures, and procedural violations, and I was prepared to file a formal complaint with the state if the HOA did not address it. Deborah lunged forward and tried to grab the binder out of my hands. The property manager yelled her name and stepped between us again, and Deborah stopped. She was breathing hard, and her hands were shaking. She pointed the flashlight at my face and said I was making threats, and she was going to file a restraining order. I did not move. I said the only thing I was threatening was accountability, and if she wanted to file a restraining order, she could explain to a judge why she was afraid of a binder full of public records. The supervisor arrived 10 minutes later. She was a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a blazer, and she looked annoyed before she even got out of her car. She walked up to the three of us and asked what was going on. Deborah started talking first, saying I was harassing her and refusing to follow packet submission rules. The supervisor held up a hand and said she wanted to hear from me. I handed her the binder and said I had evidence that needed to be reviewed before the board meeting, and I believed Deborah had been altering records and forging documents to cover up missing reserve funds. The supervisor opened the binder and flipped through the tabs. She stopped on the metadata screenshots and stared at them for a long time. Then she looked at Deborah and asked if these documents had been recently recreated. Deborah said the scans were old, and the metadata was a software glitch. The supervisor said metadata does not glitch like this, and she was going to need to see the original paper files. Deborah said the originals were in storage, and it would take a few days to retrieve them. The supervisor said she would wait. Deborah said she could not produce the originals today because the storage unit was off-site, and she did not have access after hours. The supervisor asked why the originals were off-site if they were association records that needed to be available for audits. Deborah said it was a space issue. The supervisor said that was not an acceptable answer, and she was placing Deborah on administrative leave, effective immediately, until the records could be reviewed. Deborah said the supervisor did not have the authority to do that, and only the board could suspend a custodian. The supervisor said she was the regional manager for the management company, and the management company had a fiduciary duty to the association, and if Deborah refused to cooperate, she would recommend the board terminate the management contract and hire an independent auditor. Deborah went quiet. The property manager was staring at the ground. I was still holding the binder, and I could feel my heart pounding. The supervisor turned to me and said she would include my evidence in the board packet, and the meeting would proceed as scheduled. She asked if I planned to attend. I said yes. She said she would see me there. Deborah did not leave right away. She stood there in the parking lot with her flashlight hanging off her belt and her keyring jangling in her hand, and she stared at me like she was trying to calculate her next move. Then she said I was going to regret this, and she walked back to her car. The supervisor watched her drive away, then turned to me and said I should be prepared for Deborah to escalate before the meeting. She said Deborah had a history of retaliating against residents who filed complaints, and I should document any contacts she made with me between now and the meeting date. I asked what kind of retaliation I should expect. The supervisor said usually it was more enforcement notices, but sometimes it was more creative. She said one resident had filed a complaint about selective enforcement, and the next week someone reported his trash cans to code enforcement for being visible from the street. The complaint was anonymous, but the timing was obvious. I thanked her and she handed the binder back to me. She said I should make copies of everything and keep the originals in a safe place. I said I already had. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. I had 6 days to prepare, and I spent most of that time organizing the evidence into a presentation. I wanted to walk the board through the timeline in a way that made it impossible to ignore. I started with the special assessment from 2 years ago and the missing reserve fund balance. Then I showed the forged complaint signatures and the metadata timestamps. Then I connected it all back to the current enforcement pattern and the attorney letters. The pattern was clear. Deborah had been using selective enforcement to pressure residents into paying fines, and she was funneling the money into accounts she controlled. The reserve fund discrepancy was just the first example. I found 2 more cases where special assessments had been collected and the balances had disappeared. One was for roof repairs, and the other was for landscaping. In both cases, the vendor invoices did not match the assessment totals, and the difference was reallocated to vague budget categories like administrative costs or legal reserves. I also found an ally. Her name was Monica, and she was a community manager from another HOA in Rochester who had dealt with a similar records custodian fraud case 3 years ago. I met her at a pool service job in her neighborhood, and when I mentioned what was happening at Sequoia Terrace, she said it sounded exactly like the case she had testified in. She gave me her contact information and said she would be willing to review my evidence and provide a statement if I needed it. I sent her the binder contents, and she called me back 2 days later. She said the pattern was textbook embezzlement, and she thought I had enough proof to trigger a forensic audit. She also said Deborah would try to discredit me at the meeting by attacking my credibility, and I should be ready with witnesses who could confirm my version of events. I asked if she would attend the meeting, and she said yes. 2 days before the meeting, Deborah showed up at my townhouse with a clipboard. It was a surprise inspection stunt where she arrived without notice and claimed she was conducting a routine compliance check. I opened the door, and she was standing on my porch with the clipboard, a printed checklist, and her flashlight even though it was the middle of the afternoon. She said she was here to inspect my exterior maintenance compliance, and she needed to photograph my porch, siding, and mailbox. I asked if she had given the required 24-hour notice. She said inspections did not require notice under the emergency compliance clause. I asked her to show me the clause. She said it was in the bylaws. I said I had read the bylaws and there was no emergency compliance clause. She said I must have missed it, and she was going to proceed with the inspection. I told her she was not coming onto my property without notice, and if she wanted to inspect, she could schedule it through the management company like everyone else. She said I was refusing to cooperate, and she was going to add that to my file. If you are enjoying this chaos, hit like and subscribe, because HOA drama only gets wilder from here. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. Deborah backed up and raised her clipboard like a shield. I said I wanted to be very clear that I was not refusing anything. I was asking her to follow the rules, and if she believed there was an emergency that required an immediate inspection, she could call the fire marshal or code enforcement, and they would handle it. She said this was an HOA matter, not a city matter, and I was being deliberately obstructive. I said I was being compliant, and she was being selectively aggressive. She clicked her pen and started writing on the clipboard. I asked what she was writing. She said she was documenting my refusal, and it would be included in the board packet. I said the board packet was already sealed according to her. She looked up from the clipboard, and for a second I saw panic in her eyes. Then she said the packet had been reopened for urgent compliance updates. I asked if the regional supervisor had approved that. She did not answer. She just turned and walked back to her car. I called Monica and told her what happened. She said Deborah was trying to build a case for non-cooperation so she could argue at the meeting that I was a hostile resident with a vendetta. She said I should document the interaction with a written summary and email it to the regional supervisor and the board president immediately. I did that, and I included a still frame from my doorbell camera showing Deborah on my porch with the clipboard and the timestamp. The regional supervisor replied within an hour. She said Deborah had been instructed not to contact me directly, and this was a violation of her administrative leave terms. She said she was escalating the issue to the board president, and Deborah would not be allowed to attend the meeting in any official capacity. I felt a small surge of relief, but I knew it was not over. Deborah still had allies on the board, and they were going to try to protect her. The meeting was held in the community center, which is a small building near the pool with a meeting room that holds about 40 people. I arrived early and set up my presentation on a folding table near the front. I had printed copies of the key evidence pages, and I had a USB drive with the full binder contents in case anyone wanted to review it. Monica arrived a few minutes later, and she sat in the second row where she would be visible but not intrusive. The board members started filing in around 6:30. The president was a man in his 60s named Gerald, and he looked tired. The vice president was a woman named Claire who always voted with Deborah. The treasurer was a younger guy named Mark who seemed uncomfortable. The secretary was an older woman named Linda who took notes on a laptop. Deborah was not there, but I knew she was watching. The neighborhood has a group email list where people post meeting updates in real time, and Deborah was definitely on that list. Gerald called the meeting to order at 7. He went through the standard agenda items, approving the previous meeting minutes and reviewing the treasurer report. Then he said there was a special agenda item involving a records request dispute and a formal complaint filed by a resident. He looked at me and asked if I was ready to present. I said yes. He said I would have 10 minutes and then the board would ask questions. I stood up and walked to the front table. I opened the binder and started with the reserve fund discrepancy. I showed the special assessment collection total, the vendor invoice total, and the ending balance. I pointed out the $3,600 gap and the lack of any line item explaining where it went. Claire interrupted and said the money had been reallocated to legal fees. I said there were no attorney invoices posted for that fiscal year. She said the invoices were confidential. I said invoices are not confidential under state law, and the HOA is required to disclose them in the annual financial report. She said I was not a lawyer, and I should not be making legal arguments. Monica stood up from the second row and said she was a licensed community manager, and I was correct. Claire told her to sit down. Monica stayed standing and said she had testified in a similar case, and the state had ruled that vendor invoices are public records. Gerald asked Monica who she was, and she introduced herself and said she was here as a witness. Gerald said witnesses were not on the agenda. Monica said she was a resident guest, and residents are allowed to bring guests to meetings. Gerald looked at Linda, and Linda nodded. Gerald said Monica could stay, but not speak unless the board asked her a question. Monica sat down. I continued. I showed the forged complaint signatures and explained how I had matched the handwriting to Deborah's signature on the records request invoice. Claire said handwriting analysis was not admissible. I said I was not in court, I was in an HOA meeting, and the board had a fiduciary duty to investigate credible evidence of fraud. Mark, the treasurer, leaned forward and asked to see the complaint forms. I handed him the printed pages and he studied them for a long time. Then he said the signatures did look similar. Claire said similar was not proof. Mark said it was enough to warrant an independent review. Claire said that was not his decision to make. Gerald interrupted and said the board would discuss it in executive session after the meeting. I said I did not want the discussion to happen in executive session. I wanted it on the record. Gerald said financial investigations are confidential. I said this was not a financial investigation yet. This was a resident complaint, and resident complaints are public unless they involve personal privacy issues. Gerald looked at Linda again. Linda said I was right. Gerald sighed and said the board would add the complaint to the next meeting agenda. Claire said I was wasting everyone's time with conspiracy theories, and the board had already reviewed the records and found no discrepancies. I said if the board had already reviewed the records, then they should have no problem providing the original paper files for an independent audit. Claire said the originals were in storage. I said Deborah had said the same thing, and the regional supervisor had placed her on leave because she could not produce them. Claire stood up and said the supervisor had overstepped her authority, and the board was filing a complaint with the management company. Gerald told her to sit down. She did not sit down. She said Deborah had been a faithful custodian for 5 years, and I was trying to destroy her reputation with circumstantial evidence. I said the evidence was not circumstantial, it was documentary, and if Deborah had nothing to hide, she could produce the originals and clear her name. Claire said I was attacking Deborah because she had enforced the rules against me, and I was bitter about the fines. I said I was not bitter, I was thorough, and the fines were invalid because the enforcement process was fraudulent. That was when I deployed the trump card. I said I had not mentioned my final piece of evidence yet, because I wanted the board to hear Deborah's version first. I opened the binder to the last tab and pulled out a printed copy of the enforcement policy from the association website. I held it up so everyone could see. I said this is the current enforcement policy, and it requires the custodian to send a courtesy notice before issuing a fine. I flipped to the second page and pointed to the section. I said Deborah had skipped the courtesy notice step in all 3 of my violations, and she had done it on purpose. Claire said the courtesy notice was optional. I said the policy says it is required. Claire said the board had discretion. I said the board did not write this policy, the management company did, and the management company is bound by state law. I turned to Gerald and said I had a yes or no question for him. I asked if Deborah had sent me a courtesy notice before issuing the first fine. Gerald said he did not know. I said that was not a yes or no answer. He said he would have to check the file. I said I already checked the file, and there was no courtesy notice. I asked again, did Deborah send me a courtesy notice? Gerald said no. I dropped the enforcement policy on the table. I said Deborah had been skipping required steps on purpose to accelerate the violation count and trigger my lease termination clause. I said she had admitted in a board meeting that my lease made me easier to control, and I had the audio recording to prove it. Claire said recordings were not admissible. I said this was not court, and I was allowed to reference any evidence I had. Gerald asked if I had the recording with me. I pulled out my phone and played it. The audio was clear. You could hear Deborah's voice saying the lease addendum made me easier to control, and you could hear Gerald responding that it was a good leverage point. The room went silent. Mark looked at Gerald. Linda stopped typing. Claire sat down. Gerald said the recording was taken out of context. I said the context was enforcement strategy, and the strategy was targeting me specifically because of my lease. Gerald said the board would need to review the policy and determine if any violations occurred. I said the violation already occurred, and the board needed to freeze enforcement pending a policy rewrite. Monica stood up again. She said if the board did not freeze enforcement, they were exposing the association to a lawsuit for selective enforcement and breach of fiduciary duty. Claire told her to sit down. Monica did not sit down. She said she had seen this exact pattern in another association, and the board had been sued, and the management company had been fined by the state, and the individual board members had been held personally liable. Claire said we were not in another association. Monica said the law was the same everywhere. Gerald asked Monica if she had documentation from the other case. Monica said yes, and she would email it to him tonight. Gerald said he would review it. He looked at me and asked what I wanted. I said I wanted the enforcement actions against me rescinded. I wanted a full audit of the reserve fund, and I wanted Deborah removed as custodian. Claire said that was not going to happen. Gerald said the board would take it under advisement. I said under advisement was not good enough, and if the board did not act, I would file a formal complaint with the state. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Gerald said the board would reconvene an executive session, and residents were dismissed. I packed up my binder and walked out with Monica. She said I had done well, and the board was going to have a hard time ignoring the evidence. I said I was not confident they would act. She said they did not have a choice. If they did not freeze enforcement and launch an audit, the management company would do it for them, and if the management company did not do it, the state would. I asked how long that would take. She said probably a few weeks. I said I did not have a few weeks. My lease termination clause could be triggered with one more violation, and Deborah had already tried to manufacture one with the surprise inspection. Monica said I should file a restraining order against Deborah to prevent any further contact. I said I did not think a judge would grant it. She said I should try anyway, because even if it was denied, the attempt would be on record, and it would show I was taking the harassment seriously. I filed the restraining order the next day. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Deborah did not show up, but she sent a written response through her attorney. The response said I was a hostile resident with a history of non-compliance, and the restraining order was retaliatory. The judge read the response, then read my evidence summary, then asked me if I had proof that Deborah had contacted me after being instructed not to. I showed him the doorbell camera still frame with the timestamp. He asked if I had notified the management company. I said yes, and the regional supervisor had confirmed that Deborah had been instructed not to contact me. The judge said he was granting a temporary restraining order pending a full hearing, and Deborah was prohibited from coming within 100 feet of my residence. He also said if Deborah violated the order, I should call the police immediately. I thanked him and left. 2 days later, I got an email from the regional supervisor. She said the board had voted in a closed session to freeze all enforcement actions against me pending a policy review, and they had hired an independent auditor to review the reserve fund records. She said Deborah had been terminated as custodian effective immediately, and the management company was taking over records management until a replacement could be hired. She also said the board had voted to rescind my violations and refund the fines I had paid. I replied and asked if the vote was on record. She said yes, and the minutes would be posted within 10 days. I asked if Deborah had been notified. She said yes. I asked if Deborah had responded. She said Deborah had threatened to sue the association, but her attorney had advised her not to proceed because the evidence was overwhelming. The audit results came back 3 weeks later. The auditor found that Deborah had been systematically diverting reserve fund money into a separate account she controlled, and she had been using forged board resolutions to authorize the transfers. The total amount missing was over $20,000 across 5 fiscal years. The auditor also found that Deborah had been using her custodian access to alter board minutes and delete emails that contradicted her version of events. The management company forwarded the audit report to the state, and the state opened a criminal investigation. Deborah was charged with embezzlement and fraud. Her attorney negotiated a plea deal where she agreed to repay the stolen funds and accept a 3-year probation sentence. She also agreed to surrender her HOA management credentials and never work in a fiduciary role again. The board held a special meeting to address the audit findings. Gerald opened the meeting by apologizing to the residents and admitting that the board had failed in its oversight duties. He said the board had trusted Deborah because she had been in the role for 5 years and they had not questioned her financial reports. He said that was a mistake and the board was implementing new financial controls to prevent future fraud. Claire did not apologize. She resigned from the board instead, and her resignation letter was posted on the community bulletin board the next day. The letter said she could no longer serve on a board that allowed personal vendettas to override due process. Most residents ignored it. Mark was elected as the new vice president, and Linda was elected as the new president. The board hired a new custodian, a retired accountant named Helen, who had no prior connection to Deborah or the association. The set piece I had been waiting for happened at the mailbox cluster 2 weeks after the audit report was released. I was checking my mail when Deborah pulled into the parking lot. She got out of her car and walked toward me, and I could see she was holding a folder. I stepped back and pulled out my phone. I said she was violating the restraining order, and I was calling the police. She said she was not here to talk to me. She was here to post a notice on the community board. I said the community board was 20 feet away, and she was standing 5 feet from me, which was a violation. She said she was just passing through. I said she needed to leave immediately, or I was pressing charges. She opened the folder and pulled out a printed flyer. The flyer had her photo and a statement saying she had been wrongfully terminated and she was planning to run for the board in the next election. She tried to hand the flyer to a neighbor who was walking toward the mailboxes. The neighbor looked at the flyer, looked at me, and said no thanks. Deborah tried to hand it to another neighbor. That neighbor said no thanks too. Deborah started yelling that the residents were being manipulated by lies, and they needed to hear her side of the story. A third neighbor told her to leave. Deborah said she had a right to be here. The neighbor said no, she did not, and if she did not leave, they were calling the police too. Deborah left. The final showdown happened at the next board meeting. Deborah showed up uninvited and tried to address the board during the public comment period. Linda, the new president, said Deborah was not a resident and was not allowed to speak. Deborah said she was a former employee and had a right to defend herself. Linda said Deborah had been terminated for cause, and the termination was final. Deborah said the board had not given her due process. Linda said Deborah had been given multiple opportunities to respond, and she had refused to cooperate. Deborah said the audit was biased. Linda said the audit was conducted by an independent CPA firm with no connection to the association, and the findings were supported by documentary evidence. Deborah tried to approach the board table, and 2 residents stood up and blocked her path. One of them was Monica. Deborah said Monica had no authority to interfere. Monica said she was a resident guest, and she was not going to let Deborah intimidate the board. Deborah said she was not intimidating anyone, she was exercising her rights. Monica said Deborah had no rights here, and she needed to leave before someone called the police. Linda called for a vote to remove Deborah from the meeting. The vote was unanimous. Deborah refused to leave. Linda called the police. A deputy arrived 10 minutes later and escorted Deborah out of the building. Deborah was yelling the whole way, saying the board was corrupt and the residents were sheep. The deputy told her to calm down, and she did not calm down. He told her again, and she yelled at him. He put her in the back of his patrol car and drove her off the property. The meeting continued, and Linda announced that the HOA had filed a civil lawsuit against Deborah to recover the stolen funds, and the lawsuit included a claim for punitive damages. She also announced that the board had voted to adopt new financial oversight policies, including quarterly audits and a requirement that the custodian provide monthly reports to the treasurer. The residents applauded. The lawsuit was settled 6 months later. Deborah agreed to pay back the full $20,000 plus interest, and she agreed to drop her countersuit claiming wrongful termination. The settlement included a clause prohibiting her from ever setting foot on Sequoia Terrace property again. The HOA used the recovered funds to repair the pool filtration system properly and upgrade the community center HVAC system. Linda announced the settlement at a board meeting, and the residents applauded again. I was sitting in the front row this time, and Monica was sitting next to me. She leaned over and said this was the best outcome I could have hoped for. I said I was just glad it was over. She said it was never really over, because HOAs always find new ways to create drama. I laughed and said that was probably true. The funny karma moment happened during the settlement negotiations. Deborah had demanded proof that the forged signatures were actually forged, and her attorney asked the association to produce handwriting samples from the residents whose signatures appeared on the complaint forms. The association reached out to the residents, and all three of them provided samples. The samples did not match the signatures on the forms, which confirmed the forgery. Deborah's attorney asked for an independent handwriting analysis, and Deborah had to pay for it out of pocket. The analysis came back confirming that the signatures were forged, and the handwriting matched Deborah's known samples. Her attorney withdrew from the case the next day. Deborah tried to represent herself in the settlement talks, but she did not understand the legal process, and she kept making procedural mistakes that delayed everything. Eventually, she hired a new attorney, and he convinced her to settle. When the settlement was announced, the HOA attorney made a point of saying that Deborah had demanded proof, and then the proof had confirmed everything the association had been saying all along. It was perfect. The final consequence for Deborah came from the state. The HOA attorney corrected Deborah in plain language during a deposition, explaining that her interpretation of the record's privacy clause was legally incorrect and had been used to obstruct legitimate records requests. The attorney cited 3 specific state statutes that Deborah had violated, and the transcript of that correction was included in the state's case file. Deborah had to attend a compliance hearing where the state board explained the same statutes to her again, and she was required to complete a mandatory training course on public records law. She failed the course the first time and had to retake it. The state board posted a public notice of her violations on their website, and her name is still there. The HOA froze enforcement pending a policy rewrite, exactly as I had demanded. The new policies included clear timelines for courtesy notices, mandatory documentation of all enforcement decisions, and a requirement that the custodian provide copies of all notices to the board president within 24 hours. The policies also included a whistleblower protection clause for residents who reported misconduct, and a provision allowing residents to request an independent review of any enforcement action. The board adopted the new policies unanimously, and they were posted on the association website the same day. I printed a copy and put it in my binder, just in case I ever needed it again. I am still living in Sequoia Terrace. My lease was renewed, and the violation clause was removed at my request. My landlord said the HOA had agreed to drop the clause from all future leases as part of the settlement terms. I still work as a pool service technician, and I still service 5 different HOAs, including Sequoia Terrace. The new custodian, Helen, is professional and responsive, and she actually follows the rules. I have not had a single violation notice since she took over. The neighborhood is quieter now. The group email list is still active, but the tone is different. People post about upcoming events and maintenance schedules instead of complaints and accusations. Deborah tried to join the email list under a fake name last year, but someone recognized her writing style and reported her to the moderator. She was removed immediately. Monica and I stayed in touch. She helped me understand the audit process, and she attended the settlement hearing as a witness. She said the case was one of the clearest examples of custodian fraud she had ever seen, and she was glad the state had taken it seriously. She also said I had done a good job documenting everything, and that was the key to winning. I told her I had learned that from working on pool equipment. You always document the before and after, because if something goes wrong, you need to prove it was not your fault. She laughed and said that was a good life lesson. The cold case is closed now. The missing money has been recovered, the forged documents have been exposed, and the person responsible has been held accountable. The procedural complaint that I filed forced the HOA to redo the enforcement process properly, and the new policies are designed to prevent the same kind of abuse from happening again. I know that does not guarantee anything, because people will always find ways to exploit systems. But at least now there are safeguards in place, and residents know they have options if they are targeted. That is more than we had before. I hope your week goes smoothly.